Welcome back to the Deep Dive. If you're just joining us now, this is part 2 of a pretty major 7-part deep dive. We are challenging centuries of history surrounding Adulis, one of the most vital ancient port cities in the northern Horn of Africa.
Yeah, and if you missed part 1, I really suggest you go back and listen. We laid out the core idea, which is, a bit provocative.
It really is.
The idea that Adulis wasn't just this quiet, obedient port on the edge of the Aksumite kingdom, but that it was potentially a semi-autonomous, really powerful economic center in its own right.
And today, we're not digging into artifacts or ruins just yet. We're turning the lens inward. Before you can even look at the evidence, you have to look at the rules of the game.
Biases.
The theoretical and academic biases that have, basically stopped historians from seeing the truth about Adulis for decades.
Mm-hmm.
We're kind of historical detectives today, looking for the hidden fault lines in how history gets written.
That's a perfect way to put it. Our sources today are really focused on the intellectual foundation of this whole project, and we're drawing heavily from Dr. Daniel T. Hapton-Michael's work.
Right, his 2019 PhD dissertation from UMass Amherst.
Exactly. It's called Modeling the Local Political Economy of Adulis, 1000 BCE, 700 ACE. And in it, he lays out how these deeply entrenched narratives, often fueled by colonialism, nationalism, Eurocentrism, they've completely shaped archaeology in the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and they've often blinded researchers to the real power dynamics in a place like Adulis.
Okay, let's unpack that right away.
Mm-hmm.
The problem starts at the very beginning with the basic concepts of ancient studies. The sources point out that these narrow theoretical perspectives, often designed to prop up modern national stories, created what some have called a large but problematic database.
Right. It's not just that historians were gathering facts. They were gathering facts to prove a pre-existing idea of their own greatness.
And this flawed database is rooted in a massive intellectual fracture, one that goes back 2,500 years to writers like Aeschylus and Herodotus.
Yes. They basically bifurcated the ancient world. They split it in two. On one side, you had the Greco-Roman world, the rational, the classical, and on the other, you had Egypt and the Near East.
So they just drew a line down the map and said west is one thing, east is another.
Pretty much. And this really simple east-west split was incredibly convenient for later theorists because it gave them these pre-made intellectual boxes to work with.
Okay, so people like Marx and Engels used it to distinguish between their Asiatic and classical modes of production.
Mm-hmm. But the most influential use probably came from Max Weber.
Weber, right. He argued that everything we think of as modern and rational, what we associate with modern market dynamics, only really emerged in the West, and not until after the 16th century with Calvinism.
Correct. Weber was essentially arguing that all societies before that point, including the classical ones and especially the non-Western ones, were just fundamentally different. Their economies were, in his view, embedded in the social structure.
Meaning people traded out of social duty or because the state told them to, not for the motive of pure market profit.
Exactly. And that set up a huge theoretical conflict.
And this conflict leads us straight into the substantivism debate, which, for understanding Adulis, is just essential. Karl Polanyi takes Weber's ideas and popularizes them as substantivism.
Right. Polanyi's argument was that, unlike a modern market, ancient economies were embedded in social life. So think of it this way. If you live in that kind of system, you might trade not just for profit, but because you're performing a reciprocal duty in your community.
Or because the state is mandating some kind of redistribution.
Precisely. It's an economy where your exchanges are dictated by kinship, by social status, by the needs of the state, not just by supply and demand.
Okay, that makes sense. But here's the question. If Polanyi's model was so useful for pre-modern economies, why were the Egyptologists the ones who just flat out rejected it? What was the flaw they saw?
That is the key question. Substantivism got huge traction with Near Eastern and classical historians. People like Oppenheim and Finlay loved it. But Egyptologists, they pushed back hard.
Okay.
Well, scholars like Helk argued that the super-centralized economy of the Egyptian Old Kingdom was only freed during the first intermediate period. That's when individualism could flourish. So Helk saw that as something that looked a lot more like Weber's description of the rise of capitalism.
So they were basically saying, hey, hold on a minute. We see profit-driven economic thinking and competition right here in ancient Egypt. Your embedded redistributive model is just Too simple.
You've got it. And this is the exact moment where all this high-level theory actually impacts our understanding of Adulis. Because if we can show that Adulis's economy wasn't just based on state redistribution,
Meaning it wasn't just Axum taking all the wealth.
but it was actually a place where powerful local people were pursuing wealth in a market-conscious way, then you elevate Adulis from being a mere outpost to a powerful, capital-conscious trade hub. This whole academic fight dictates how we read the evidence from the ground.
And this is where that theoretical fight leads to a paralyzing practical problem, what our source calls the location frenzy in the Red Sea.
Yes.
Because scholars were trapped in these theoretical boxes, east versus west, embedded versus market. It led them to obsess over just one thing, pinpointing where ancient places were, instead of understanding how they worked.
The classic example is the Punt controversy. Punt was famous in Egyptian texts. It was the source of all these crucial aromatics and materials for mummification. But for centuries, scholars just fought over its exact coordinates.
They put it everywhere, right? Syria, India, Southern Arabia.
All over the map. And that's like trying to understand the entire economic impact of, say, Silicon Valley just by pointing to a pin on a map of Palo Alto. You miss the entire network.
Right, you miss the whole point.
Precisely. The critical failure, according to the source material, is that Punt was reduced to just a geographical spot. This obsession meant scholars never even tried to model the actual socioeconomic relationship between Egypt and Punt. The location became the end goal.
And we see the same thing plaguing the study of Adulis. Classicists had all these different names for places in the sources, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, Pliny, Strabo, and they just got tied up in knots asking things like, was Strabo's Berenike near Sabi the same place as Pliny's Berenike Pankrisos? Were they both actually Adulis?
Habtemok has a great term for this. He calls it the tyranny of ancient Greek texts. Scholars were just uncritically accepting these different place names as is,
Treating them like a perfect historical GPS record.
instead of treating them as evidence of social complexity. I mean, the failure wasn't just geographical, it was methodological. They should have been trying to figure out why foreign names get accepted or rejected or changed by different groups of people. The changing names are evidence of social change itself.
That's a huge distinction.
It is. And now, while that old east-west split is, slowly resolving, it's being replaced by another profound division, north versus south.
Meaning what, exactly?
Due to huge economic and political imbalances, we have a data-rich north, specifically Egypt, and a data-poor south, which is Northeast Africa.
So that sounds like a modern problem that ends up reinforcing ancient biases. If you don't have the local archaeological data from the south, you have no way to challenge the established narratives that almost always originated in the north.
Absolutely. It limits indigenous archaeological practice and just keeps reproducing this knowledge imbalance. The research on Adulis, which is in the northern Horn of Africa, is a direct attempt to bridge that gap. And to even start to understand that region, we have to look at the macro-level historical paradigms that have developed over the last 300 years.
And these paradigms, they weren't just developed in an academic vacuum. They were often influenced by major historical events, things like Italy's defeats at Dogali and Adwa in the late 1800s, or Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935.
Exactly. So let's look at the first two dominant narratives that the Adulis research really has to push back against. First, you have the Orientalist Semiticist paradigm. This was championed by early European scholars, people like Ludolf and Conti Rossini.
You mentioned a diffusionist model earlier. For anyone who's not familiar with that term, what does that mean we talk about civilization coming to the Horn of Africa?
It means that civilization, things like writing, monumental architecture, complex agriculture, it diffused or flowed from a single external source. And in this paradigm, the core argument was that Sabaeans, migrating from South Arabia across the Bab el-Mandeb around the first millennium BC, brought all the sophisticated culture with them.
So the local indigenous groups were just primitive recipients.
Yeah.
Anything sophisticated had to have come from somewhere else and just landed there fully formed.
That's the idea. But this model was challenged by epigraphic evidence. Critics pointed out that the Sabine script was actually fully developed and exploited only in the northern Horn of Africa, which suggests the inhabitants used the script with, and this is a quote, "freedom and originality hardly betrays the behavior of simple borrower." It was an innovation, not just passive borrowing. This whole narrative was also supported by what's called the geographical isolation framework. Like Gibbon's famous idea that the Abyssinians slept near 1,000 years.
The idea that the whole region was just dormant, waiting for an outside influence to wake it up? Okay, that brings us to the second big narrative, the Aksumite paradigm.
Right, and this one was developed internally by local institutions, especially the Orthodox Monophysite Church and the ruling class. And it was later formalized by local scholars. It relies very heavily on Gui's texts, most famously the Kyberneis.
The Glory of Kings.
The Glory of Kings, yeah.
Which establishes the royal lineage going all the way back to the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon and their son, Menelik I.
Correct. So this narrative emphasizes an indigenous or a divine origin, and it promotes the religious and cultural supremacy of Gui's civilization. And here's why that is so critical for Adulis. This paradigm inherently emphasizes Aksum's absolute centrality.
Which means Adulis is treated as
Aksum's little brother. As a peripheral, dependent port whose entire existence is just to serve the centralized state. And that is the very historical claim that Dr. Heptemichael's dissertation is challenging with material evidence.
So after those two dominant narratives, we start to see the emergence of a couple of counter-establishment paradigms, right, starting in the mid-20th century.
Yes, exactly. The third one is the leftist paradigm. This was a reaction really spurred by global decolonization and the academic shifts in the 1960s. It was critical of both the Orientalist and the Aksumite establishments. They completely shifted the focus away from kings and monuments.
So they focused instead on things like class formation, resistance, and the history of groups that were usually underrepresented, the Oromo, peasants, Muslims, the groups that were often just ignored in the big royal stories.
Exactly. You see this in Asmer Mlajessa's work on the egalitarian Oromo Gada system. This scholarship was all about integrating those previously erased histories, emphasizing that the region's past was internally varied, not just dictated by one ruling civilization.
And finally, we get the Pan-African paradigm, championed by thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois and Cheikh Anta Diop. This was aimed at liberation, at unity.
It was. It asserted Africa's monumental contribution to world civilization, often centering on Egypt, and it viewed the Northern Horn of Africa as, quote, the quintessence of Africa and the rock of Black resistance.
But there was a limitation there, too.
There was. Pan-Africanism was absolutely essential for challenging colonialist rhetoric and the idea of African backwardness. However, Heptemichael points out a key limitation. Though it was well-intentioned, it sometimes failed to fundamentally dismantle the method of diffusionism.
So it just shifted the origin point.
In some cases, yes, it would just shift the origin point from, say, Europe to Africa, for instance, asserting an Egyptian origin for all culture, instead of destroying the core idea that culture has to flow from a single source. And that's a kind of claim that rigorous archaeological data has to temper.
That is a critical point.
Yeah.
So after this whole intellectual journey, what does it all mean for the study of one port city?
I mean, the central finding of this whole methodological review is that every society is internally varied. And its connections, both regional and interregional, they have to be studied if you want to avoid the pitfalls of all these parochial isms.
We have to look beyond what the texts claim and look at what the built environment demanded.
That's it. So the ultimate goal here is to move past these fractured, often politically motivated models. The dissertation uses world systems theory to define the region, and then it applies these really rigorous anthropocentric methods like studying the architecture of Adulis to evaluate its actual power.
Right, so by calculating the labor and the time it would have taken to build Adulis's major structures, the research can actually estimate the social power and the wealth that was needed to get those projects done.
Precisely. And that is hard material evidence that can directly challenge the Aksumite model's insistence on a dependent, peripheral relationship.
This really sets the stakes high. It's clear that the historical study of the Northern Horn of Africa is a constant battle against confusing myth with history and archaeology with ideology. It sounds like the high bar for this research is based on a quote, that if you have sufficient data and you analyze it rigorously, archaeology can have the power to restrain fantasy.
Absolutely. And when you think about that deep-seated north-south divide in knowledge production,
Right.
where a lack of data just continually reinforces political narratives and marginalization, well, the detailed material study of a single crucial site like Adulis becomes a really critical act. It's a way of challenging these long-standing, often politically motivated academic divisions.
It encourages us to consider the data imbalances in how knowledge is produced today and how focusing on a single, well-studied site can help us rewrite much larger historical narratives. Join us next time for part 3 of this 7-part deep dive. We're finally going to shift from the theoretical context to the material evidence. We'll start analyzing the hard data gathered from the built forms and the artifacts of Adulis itself, and we'll see how a trowel and a 3D model can start to dismantle 1,000 years of political narrative.
Remember when we kept saying punt? Well, turns out we totally slipped up. It should have been punt.